Good morning, everybody. I'm Burt Garland, not Phil Brandt, but Burt Garland, and welcome to This Week at Work.
This Week at Work is the only show about the workplace that offers you front row seats and a microphone, featuring experts in human resources and employment law to bring you practical, timely, and accurate insights so you can more effectively lead your organization. It's Thursday, June 20th, episode 284. Today, does Gen Z lack the independence, motivation, and real-world knowledge to thrive in their careers? In 2024, some employers think so, and likely many more will after hearing about this study from ResumeTemplates.com, revealing surprising statistics about their reliance on parents, including bringing them to job interviews. Hopefully the tag-along is due to them only having their driver's permit. So are they just smartly leveraging support, or is this a deeper issue? Tanya Zion joins Burt to discuss how employers can navigate this challenge to save the future of the workforce. All this and more on This Week at Work.
All right, well, as you can see that my buddy Phil is not with us today, but we are very fortunate to have a superstar guest, Tanya Zion, with us today. Tanya, welcome back to the program.
Well, thanks. Thanks for having me.
Pleasure to have you. I understand you're actually in St. Louis today. Is that right?
I am. I even tried to steal Phil's office, but it didn't work. So, shucks.
Phil doesn't like anybody stealing his office, I bet.
Probably not, but it would have been fun.
All right. So what are you doing in town, Tanya?
So I'm actually visiting a member. We're reviewing some of their employee engagement survey. I've been engaged with them on leader development, and we are doing a review of that and some follow-up focus groups. So it's been a very productive few days.
All right. Well, great. Well, I can't wait to talk to you a little bit later in the program about the generations in the workplace, including some really interesting stuff about Gen Z and an interesting survey that was done recently about Gen Z in the workplace. But before we do that, we want to get to today's poll questions. And the first one's going to be an open-ended question for our viewers today, and that is, what are your thoughts? And this does give you a little bit of a preview about what Tanya and I are going to chat about today. What are your thoughts on a candidate bringing a parent to a job interview? What are your thoughts about a candidate bringing a parent to a job interview? And again, this is an open-ended question for you today. And then moving on, our second poll question today is, we're asking you to rate how likely it is for you to hire a candidate who brings their parent to a job interview. Very simple. If the job candidate brings their parent to a job interview, does that impact how likely you are or are not to hire that particular candidate? So go ahead and put your answers in the poll responses, and we'll get to those hopefully a little bit later in the program. All right, well, I think it's time for us to shift over to Lawyer on the Clock today. So since I am introducing myself, Nick, go ahead and pull that lever.
All right, it's time to look into what's trending in employment law. Lawyer, you're on the clock.
So today, Tanya, I've got three topics for you. The first one's going to be a new decision from a federal court that governs Louisiana and Mississippi, and it relates to the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act. Interestingly, in this case, on the eve of the effective date of the EEOC's final Pregnant Workers Fairness Act regulations, their final rule, a federal court in Louisiana postponed the effective date of what the court describes as the final rules requirement that covered entities provide accommodation for the elective abortions of employees that are not necessary to treat a medical condition related to the pregnancy, end quote, until final judgment is entered in pending litigation. So this order really only impacts employers with employees working in Louisiana and Mississippi. The EEOC's final rule was supposed to go into effect just on Tuesday of this week, June 18th. And this federal court decision from Louisiana does postpone that with respect to just certain employers in Louisiana and Mississippi. So this is not a broad federal ruling. It applies just in those states. I want to make it very clear there are a couple of other lawsuits that were challenging this Pregnant Workers Fairness Act final rule. 17 states had filed a lawsuit in the Eastern District of Arkansas. That case was dismissed and is likely to be appealed. Previously, a federal court in Texas in a different case permanently enjoined the EEOC, the Department of Justice, from enforcing the PWFA against the state of Texas in February 2024 when it found that Congress improperly passed the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2023, and that case is currently on appeal. So what all this means for private employers with at least 15 employees across the country is that the EEOC's final rule is in effect as of June 18th, 2024. Litigation is going to continue to work its way through the courts. And for now, the only private employers, other than the plaintiffs in that particular lawsuit in Louisiana, the only private employers impacted by that Western District of Louisiana's decision pausing the effective date of the final rules requirement that covered employers provide accommodations for elective abortions are employers with employees in Louisiana and Mississippi. So I want to stress that this is not a very, very broad ruling. All right, so then we're going to shift over and I want to talk about two other cases that are somewhat related. And this is also very, very recent news in the last week or so. An NLRB judge ruled that Starbucks violated federal law by sending its baristas home for wearing union t-shirts. In this case, the judge issued his decision last Wednesday, a week ago, yesterday, and he called it jarring that workers at Starbucks unionized Caesars Bay Cafe were the only company employees in the area to be sent home for a single dress code violation, which was wearing a union t-shirt. Meanwhile, Starbucks baristas in the area at other stores, according to the judge, often flouted the dress code rule that the workers were punished for violating wearing graphic t-shirts as well as other dress code rules. And so the judge held that the only logical conclusion to draw from these facts is the message on the union t-shirt raised respondent ire, and its stricter enforcement of the dress code sought to discourage union and other protected activities taking place at the particular store. And it would be unlawful for an employer to enforce rules more strictly in response to union activity. So what the point of the case is that the NLRB judge is saying that the employees, the baristas who wore pro-union shirts at work were disciplined more harshly. They were sent home after a single violation than other employees who wore other types of graphic t-shirts, which violated the dress code rule, and they were not treated as harshly. They were not sent home immediately or disciplined immediately. So we get to what appears to be a case of inconsistent enforcement of an otherwise valid rule. Although curiously, in this case, the judge did say that moving forward, Starbucks is to cease and desist from disciplining employees from wearing t-shirts, and then interestingly, to take the ban on graphic t-shirts out of its dress code, calling the ban overly broad and saying Starbucks didn't justify it. That's the part of this case that I think could end up in the federal court system. And my hunch is that the NLRB judge went too far saying that Starbucks could not ban graphic t-shirts as part of its dress code. So we'll have to keep our eyes on that one. Also with Starbucks in the news, shifting gears just a little bit, this is really a pretty big development that took place at the end of last week. And basically, unless you've been, living under a rock the last few years, you clearly are aware that Starbucks has been fighting a very tough battle over unionization of its employees. In dealing with the union, seeking to represent its employees, Starbucks has also really had to deal with the NLRB quite often, which has, as I mentioned several times, been acting through its very aggressive and openly pro-union general counsel, the board's general counsel. And they have filed dozens of unfair labor practice complaints against Starbucks, alleging that Starbucks is engaged in a wide range of purportedly unlawful conduct when responding to union organizing. The particular case that the Supreme Court decided was whether the NLRB should benefit from a lower standard of proof for obtaining injunctions against employers like Starbucks that would require employers like Starbucks to restore the status quo that existed prior to the alleged unfair labor practice, while the legal challenge to the alleged unfair labor practice is pending before the board. In this particular case, the board had obtained an injunction against Starbucks requiring Starbucks to rehire terminated employees, while the underlying unfair labor practice complaint was litigated before the NLRB. And again, there are several federal circuits out there, the Third, the Fifth, and the Sixth Circuits, that only require the NLRB to demonstrate that there is reasonable cause to believe an unfair practice occurred, and that injunctive relief would be just and proper in order to secure an injunction. There are other circuits out there, the Fourth, for particular for our listeners, the Seventh that covers Illinois and Indiana, and the Eighth, which covers Missouri, and then the Ninth Circuit as well. They utilize the more rigorous and traditional four-part test to gauge whether temporary injunctive relief should be granted before a matter is fully and finally litigated to judgment. And so that test evaluates whether the NLRB is likely to succeed on the merits of the underlying unfair labor practice complaint, whether there's irreparable harm that will result in if an injunction does not issue, the balance of the equities tips in favor of injunctive relief, and an injunction is in the public interest. So again, very significantly, the Supreme Court decided that the case was really simple enough. It boiled the issue down to this question: does the NLRB enjoy a lower burden to obtain injunctive relief than other litigants, or does the traditional four-part test apply? The Supreme Court here was nearly unanimous. Only Justice Jackson partially dissented, but she did ultimately concur in the court's judgment to vacate the injunction here and remand the case to the Sixth Circuit. Justice Thomas wrote for the majority, and he said he rejected the NLRB's position that a lower burden applies to NLRB's request for injunctive relief, and the court held that instead that traditional four-part test, likelihood of success, irreparable harm, balance of equities, and public interest applies. And so this does substantially weaken the NLRB's ability to obtain injunctive relief against employers. And we've talked about it on the show before. We've talked about the Chevron deferral standard before, that's before the U.S. Supreme Court right now. I personally think this foreshadows a little bit about where the Supreme Court is heading on Chevron deferral. And as I've opined before on the program, I think that that 40-plus-year-old standard of Chevron is probably in jeopardy. But we'll see how it plays out. And with that, that's what I've got for you on Lawyer on the Clock today. So I know we want to move into our other topic today, but before we do that, I know we've got a couple of items to cover on Philbert's Forum. Even though Phil's not with us today, we're still running with Philbert's Forum. Nick, what do you got for us?
You've just entered Philbert's Forum, where we peel the onion back and take a lighter look at the workplace. Okay, so let's just go ahead and say I didn't have time to Photoshop Phil and Burt's heads on this. But what we see here is a clip from, I believe, Step Brothers, which in the pre-production show sounds like none of us have seen, but we've certainly seen clips and know the stooges they can be. Well, here we say some candidates could definitely benefit from a parental representative. And here it says they'll actually be interviewing as a team, and I would say that's probably still not even enough. What do you guys think?
I think those two could definitely benefit from a parental representative.
So we have here a bit of a transcript, let's say, from an interview with a Gen Z candidate. And here the interviewer asks, would you say you're independent? And the candidate looks at Mom. Mom nods. And the candidate says, I'd say so, yes. So this is under the caption of make sure they have their parents' permission for the interview.
Wonderful. I think that that is probably one of the steps on how not to be successful in the job interview. Tanya, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that really doesn't play well to your strengths and how you're going to be accountable for the work we're hiring you to do. So excited to talk about this topic today.
Yeah, well, I think that is actually a really good segue into the topic that we want to focus on today. And I know we've given a little bit of a preview throughout the lead into the show today and in some of what we've chatted about. But there's a really interesting article that was published recently, just a couple of weeks ago, and it was published by a company called Resume Templates.
Mhm.
And this article that was published, and you can go to resumetemplates.com, you can find the article yourself, but they conducted a survey of 1,428 US based Gen Zers. And we'll talk about this during the program, but they define Gen Zers right now as 18 to 27. And they said that one of these 1,428 Gen Zers who were looking for jobs within the past year, they wanted to understand how much they rely on their parents when job searching. Now, we know that Gen Z has a reputation for lacking independence, motivation, and real work knowledge to contribute in the workplace. And the article stated that at the beginning. The study highlights are this, and some of these really, if you think about them, are not surprising at all. And I think, are equally applicable to you and to me, Tanya, when we were starting our job searches. But then some of the study results really are somewhat shocking. So some of the highlights are this: 70% of Gen Zers asked their parents for help in the job search process. Now, while that number might sound high, I think back to when we were looking for jobs. Tanya, you and I are similar in age here, and we're squarely in the millennials, or I'm sorry, the Gen X. We're trying to make us younger than we are. We're squarely within Gen X. And 70% of Gen Zers ask their parents for help in the job search process. I really don't see anything wrong with that. And frankly, if they're not doing that, I think that's a mistake. You should always try to network with whoever you can. So that stat did not surprise me. Of those who found a job, the survey found 83% credited success to their parents. Again, that doesn't, in and of itself, really doesn't surprise me that much. If you think about networking and asking a parent for help, that does not shock me. What are your thoughts on that piece of it, Tanya?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, still today, if I had to build a resume, I would go seek expertise, right? I'd hire someone to help me with that. So I'm not surprised that in your first job search, you're seeking that out. So I completely agree with you. But then the article goes on.
It does. It goes on, and this is where the survey, in my opinion, goes off the rails. Not the survey itself, but the results.
Yeah.
25%, think about that. That's one quarter. 25% of Gen Zers brought their parent to a job interview. 16% of Gen Zers say their parents actually submitted the job application for them. And then it gets back on the rails, I think, when it says 1 in 10 had their parents write their resume. And that doesn't bother me as much. That's only 10%. And it kind of, again, if you rely on parental expertise that's been in the workforce, asking for help on a resume really does not bother me. But what I want to focus on here, Tanya, is this number of 25%, 1 in 4 Gen Zers are bringing their parents to a job interview. What does that say to you?
Well, I was curious about this. So I too dug into the study and tried to understand where it was coming from. And Simon Sinek, who you might know, he has a viral YouTube video that talks about the power of why. He's talking a lot about Gen Z. And what he cites as maybe related to this is that mental health studies that we see in Gen Z and the level of anxiety among Gen Zers is higher than we've ever seen. We just haven't equipped our Gen Z population to handle anxiety and stress. And so I think perhaps as parents, rather than to see our kids suffer, maybe we're stepping in even beyond helicoptering and coming in as like a safety blanket. But I think we need to step back and really understand, is that the best way to equip them? Because ultimately, they're going to need to go to work alone.
Well, that's a really good point, and it's sort of like we've actually talked about this on the program before. That kind of the generation where everyone gets a participation trophy. Are we really doing our younger generation a favor? Tanya, I know during the pre-show you and I chatted about this, and I mentioned at the dinner table last night, all three of my kids are squarely within Gen Z. And it happened. My daughter, I love her to death. She came in from New York on her own. She conspired with my other kids. She came in for Father's Day and surprised me. So I had all three of my kids at home with me on Father's Day. And we were chatting at the dinner table literally last night before she left. And my kids were appalled when I shared the story with them, and they didn't believe the results. They said of anyone they don't know anyone who's brought a parent to a job interview. And so I said to my son, I said, well, I don't think they're making the study up. I believe the study. Now, whether the study is valid or not, that I don't know because I haven't dug into it. I don't know if there's any scientific validity to the story, but my kids' reactions, who are Gen Z, were appalled by this.
Yeah, mine too. So I have these conversations. I have two kids that are going to find like summer jobs and finding their place in the world. And I've certainly helped them. We even did a mock interview. Hey, be prepared with some of these questions that might be asked. But my kids would be absolutely shocked. And even their friends, I can't imagine them taking a parent. However, when I'm out with members, and especially in that manufacturing space, I've had GMs tell me, I let somebody go and I got a phone call from the dad. I've had parents show up to say, my kid won't come to work. What can we do to work together to make this happen? And, members are really somewhat at a loss of how to meet this generation where they're coming in. And I think because we have so many employers that listen to this program, I think that's really the main question in all of this. Once we have this data, what do we do with it? And how do we need to look at things like maybe offering, again, I'm referencing Simon Sinek, but he calls soft skills human skills. So do we need to have a human skills boot camp as part of our onboarding and on-ramping system so that we can start to equip these kids of ways to know they're going to get feedback, know that they're going to have clear expectations so that we can ease them into the workforce? Because if this is happening and we need those workers, we're going to have to come up with some sort of solution.
We do. Now, in all fairness, I do have to say that Gen Z has been through quite a bit. They were born either just before, during, or in the wake of 9/11. They were got to see both Gulf Wars. They've seen the economic crisis of 2008. They've seen quite a bit. They've been here for COVID. They were living through the thicks of COVID. And so they have been through quite a lot, and I think we do have to understand, not just as parents, but as employers, that they have been through a lot. But I do think it's really important that while we're taking that into account, that we still have to parent and teach this generation the skills that are necessary to succeed in the workplace over the long term.
Yeah,
What can we do, Tanya, to facilitate that?
Yeah, I can't agree more with what you're saying. And just of note, the graduating seniors this year started their freshman year in COVID. My son was one of those, that class. And so I do think that we're already identifying different characteristics. They didn't have to turn work in on time. They could save up all their assignments and turn it in. And I know that a lot of students struggled with that throughout their high school career. So I think one, just understanding and putting yourself in the mind frame of, hey, this is their experience, so you can meet them where they are. But I think we as parents have to find that balance in our own homes to equip our children to do practice interviews. There are lots of resources. There are career coaches that you can tap into. There's so much information online. And so I think within our households, I always say the greatest work I ever do will be inside the walls of our home. And I think this is a plea to parents out there that we really do need to equip our children, because there is employment. We want your children to come to work for us, but they have to come with some of those basic human skills and coping mechanisms so that they can be successful in the workplace.
Katie, I know we're getting close on time here, but there's a couple graphics I'm going to ask Nick to put up. And it occurs to me that one of the things that we can do in the workplace, and I know you've talked about this on the program before, but if you don't mind talking just a little bit about the fact that for the first time really in human history, that given the fact that people are living longer and working longer, we have 5 generations in the workplace. Now, I know that the oldest generation on these graphics is not a huge part of the workplace, but one of the things that it occurs to me is that we can take opportunities to try to match up some of these Gen Zers with the millennials and the baby boomers and the greatest generation, some of whom are still in the workforce, and try to pair them up to gain some of these skills that it takes to be successful in the workplace. Maybe you can chat about that just a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. I think mentorship programs are going to become more and more of a tool that we can leverage in the workplace. There's a lot of corporate knowledge that exists in some of those older generations and just best practices. And so in having some sort of intentional mentoring program where we are providing support for not only the mentor, but also the mentee, how to utilize this relationship, what information should you expect to gain. I think formal programs like that can really take the strengths of both generations on either end of the spectrum and put them to work. You know, some of your oldest team members may not be super digitally nimble. Well, you've got Gen Zers who are digital natives. So if you're indexing information, if you're doing anything like that, partner them up on project teams. And I think that you'll find if you equip them from the beginning, you can get a lot more output by the combination of their strengths rather than just putting them alone.
And one of the phenomenon we've seen post-COVID, well, we were even seeing it pre-COVID, but certainly post-COVID, is we are seeing some of the oldest generation actually coming back into the workforce. And this is for several reasons. The retirement savings don't go as far as they used to. They're having to care for other family members in the younger generations. The economy is very tough out there. Inflation's run wild. And then there's another piece to it, and that is that there's opportunity for older workers out there because employers want them and need them because they are good and dedicated workers. And so if you have the benefit of having some of these older folks in the workplace, and I'm talking about folks who are older than you and me and even older than Phil, but if we have the benefit of having some of these older folks in the workplace, some of these younger generations can learn a thing or two from this older generation.
Yeah, I would look at your flexible work arrangements. We sometimes think about that for the youngest generations, but can you allow maybe people a part-time schedule, and how does that work? So there's a lot of ability to really utilize the strengths of all of these generations. But again, I think it's going to take us taking a step back and really considering, is the way we've always done things the best approach in the current environment?
Yep, and Nick's going to put up the link to this story, this article, this survey, if anybody wants to take a deeper dive into it. I did find it fascinating. Tanya, I can't tell you how much I appreciate you stepping in on the program today, and that really wraps things up. We'll get you our poll results as well down the road here, and with that, we will see you back here next week at 7:30 for another episode of This Week at Work. Until then, go out and be good to somebody. Thank you.
Thank you once again for tuning in to This Week at Work. If you enjoy the show, please share it with your colleagues, forward our invites, share the link, aimea.org/This Week at Work, or follow or subscribe wherever you get your news and entertainment. LinkedIn, YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, we're everywhere you are. Don't forget you can be part of the show. Send your questions and comments anytime to info@thisweek.work. We'll see you next week, 7:30 a.m. Central Time, when we discuss what's happening this week at work.